Hello, I'm Dr. Cindy Lacom. I direct the Gender Studies program at Slippery Rock University, where I've been employed for 27 years. I'm thrilled to be part of this, and I welcome you on board. In terms of how we define diversity, this slide is fairly self-evident, but I want to just add that oftentimes in our society, we tend to think of diversity in very specific ways, often in terms of racial diversity. And though that is absolutely important, I want to encourage all of us to begin to think about different definitions and understandings of diversity that would include things like age and ageism, ethnicity, religion, disability. We live in a very ableist culture, and that's a term amongst our isms, racism or sexism, we typically forget about. I also think we need to think about things like body size, because in a sizes culture where fat shaming is pervasive, we need to think about how that might impact the experience of someone's experience in work. And fat shaming is gendered. It happens to women more often than it does to men. So this is a lot to think about, but I would encourage you to do so. In terms of the bottom line revenue, this data is also fairly self-explanatory, but I want to say that though 34% of Fortune 500 boards include at least one woman or one minority, that number remains really low, and it's up from the last 5 years. It's gone up every single year. We need to remember how powerful Fortune 500 companies is part of this. We need to know that they generate 2/3 of the United States GDP, that they generate revenues totaling annually $13.7 trillion, and they employ globally almost 29 million people. This matters. What we also know is that they not only then have incredible financial clout, but in terms of their impact on our day-to-day lives, that's also pretty vast. We know that in terms of lobbying, we don't have accurate data on how much they spend, but we know that in 2017, Google spent over $18 million lobbying Washington, D.C. Some of the companies that are in the Fortune 500 that spend billions on lobbying besides Google are Comcast, Boeing, and General Electric. And the last is the only one that actually shares publicly how much they spent on lobbying efforts. This means that they have a huge impact on everything from regulations of our oil and gas industry to FDA decisions about food and drugs to what can and can't be allowed in school lunches. This means that they impact all of our lives, even if we don't know it. In terms of gender and diversity, what this means is that if most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are white, straight, cisgender men, there is an absence of consideration in many cases of diversity issues. And that matters because if I live in a poor neighborhood, if I am a person with a disability, I am less likely to be protected in terms of these lobbying efforts. Inclusion. I want to draw a distinction between diversity, which might mean that I have 20% of my employees are people of color and another 15% are genderqueer. That's a diverse workplace culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that workplace culture is inclusive. Inclusion has to mean that we create a working environment where all people are welcome, where variations and differences are respected, if not necessarily fully accepted. And I would say that in our current workplace environment, this has to mean that we provide workshops on unconscious bias. We'll get to that in a little bit. Workshops on privilege. We'll get to that in a little bit as well. We need to have ongoing training and everything from where jobs are advertised to promotion policies, to hiring policies, to management policies. And if they're not really recognizing diversity and nurturing it, it's not really an inclusive environment. So some demographics for Fortune 500 companies. What we know is that fewer than 20% of these seats are held by minorities, and that's with the broadest definition of minority possible. African American Black women make up very few. We know that only three CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women of color. Only 5 are African American total, and only 1 Fortune 500 CEO is out and gay. And that's Tim Cook of Apple. As this quote says, diversity often means you have one or two people. Representation means something quite different. In order to achieve representation, we're going to have to up our numbers of Fortune 500 CEOs, Fortune 500 managers, and Fortune 500 boards. I'm going to allow this to sit for a moment and have it speak for itself. Again, what we know is that we need greater representation, and we need to make sure that corporate boards are welcoming and not necessarily hostile. This means active listening to minority and marginalized people. This means respecting them. This means taking their ideas and actually doing something with it. And it means taking or giving them credit for the work that they're doing. We're going to talk in a minute about an essay by Peggy McIntosh called White Privilege, Unpacking the Backpack of White Privilege. But I want to kind of take apart, deconstruct this notion of what privilege is. As this notes, it is systemic and it is structural. It means that I have access as a white, able-bodied, highly educated, straight, cisgender woman. I have access to all sorts of privilege. The one identity marker that probably keeps me from complete access to privilege is that I'm a woman. And in a youth-obsessed culture, arguably, as I age, I will have less access to that kind of youth-based privilege. But there are privileges that come with age as well. I am more likely to be taken seriously as a leader than a 19-year-old might be at my university. I am more likely to have access to economic power because of my earning potential at this point in my life. So when we think about privilege, there may be exceptions. It may be that you say, well, my dad does all the cooking. And my response is, we are not worthy. That's great. But he still has access to structural male privilege in a way that I would not. I want to just give you one example because I hear this a lot. I want to give you the example of a white man who is straight, who grows up in a very poor home and has to work incredibly hard to overcome that poverty, his parents' absence of education or undereducated status. And he's really worked his buns off. He's worked very hard. He may well say to me, I don't have access to privilege. And yet his being straight, white, cisgender, and male does give him access to particular structures of privilege. So Kimberly Crenshaw is an African-American legal feminist scholar who coined the term intersectionality 20 years ago. And she came across the term, she coined it because she found a case at General Motors of a woman who filed a case against them for discrimination because as a Black woman, she lost her job. And what GM said at the time was, we didn't discriminate you because we hire women, and we didn't discriminate against you because we hire Black people. The issue is the women that they hired were white, and they were doing primarily secretarial and clerical work, and the Black people that they hired were overwhelmingly men, and they were doing the hard physical labor of the plant. What they said was, we are not discriminating against you, but they were in fact discriminating against her, not as a woman, not as a Black person, but as a Black woman. So Kimberly Crenshaw started to think about this notion of intersectionality as intersecting or overlapping identity markers which are marginalized or minoritized that expose a person to intersecting and overlapping forms of discrimination. And I'm hoping that that would make sense. I want to use a current example as of today, May 2020, of COVID-19. What we know is that COVID is having intersectional impacts. We know that Navajos, for instance, are being disparately impacted by this. We know that people with disabilities are being disparately impacted by COVID. There are higher mortality rates and higher infection rates. And if we look at nursing homes, we know this. But I want to offer a less recognized example, and that is the impact that air pollution has on the severity of COVID-19 symptoms. This has an impact because Blacks and Latinas tend to live closer to toxin producing factories. So I'm going to read a quote. 78% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a toxin spewing coal plant. 71% of African Americans and 80% of Latinos live in counties in the United States that violate federal air pollution standards. What this means is that we don't usually think of that when we think of COVID. We probably think that it's an equal opportunity virus, but in fact, it's not. If we are understanding intersectionality, we're better able to understand different ways in which discrimination and structural bias are being played out. So this is Peggy McIntosh, who I just mentioned. And I want to just talk a little bit. I love some of the examples that she offers, but she wrote this piece because as a feminist scholar, what she was trying to do was explain to men how and why they had access to structural privilege. And many of them became hostile, they were skeptical, they might have been defensive. And then she began to think about this in terms of her own whiteness. And what she recognized was that as a white person, she had access to all sorts of structural privilege, which she'd never really thought about. So she began to pen this incredibly powerful essay. It's had a huge impact on feminist and critical race studies. And what she realized was that in ways both large and small, she simply hadn't thought about it. And that means everything from a flesh colored band aid being, in fact, the color of a white person, to if she has a complaint to make, she can count pretty much on the fact that the person to whom she's going to make the complaint will be white, will look like her. So it's a really useful term to think about, and it's useful to understand this idea in its biggest kind of context. Systemic privilege, I'll pause here for a moment and let you look at some of these examples. I'm not going to go on too much about this. I think that it's fairly self-evident. I want to go back, though, to one thing in terms of intersectionality, and that is this. As a feminist teaching gender studies, historically, I've talked about the gender wage gap. The gender wage gap exists. Women make 79 to 80% of what men make for every dollar that a man makes. And that data is borne out over and over again. But when we talk about the gender wage gap, what we too often leave out is the race gendered wage gap. So I want to just give you a little bit of information. This is what we know. Black women make only 61 cents to every dollar that white men make. They make 21% less than white women. So in terms of intersectionality, we can never just talk about the gender wage gap. We have always got to talk about the gender wage gap in intersectional contexts. Unconscious bias is exactly what it says. It is bias which we may carry, which we're not aware of. It's different than overt bias, which might be when I use a racist term or a homophobic term meaningfully. But unconscious bias might mean, as a professor, that I expect better things of a white blonde student. Or I had a colleague probably 2 decades ago say about an Asian student in his class, well, I know they're going to do good work because that's what Asians do. So even if it's a positive bias, it can be problematic. I want to add one other thing that moves us a little bit into the realm of theory, but in terms of unconscious bias, there is a legal feminist scholar whose name is Nancy Tuana, who wrote an essay called Coming to Understand: The Epistemology of Ignorance. And epistemology is a way, it's a way to understand how we create knowledge. It's a philosophy of knowing. How do we come to know something? How does it come to be normalized or naturalized? And in her essay, Tuana argues that if there is an epistemology of knowledge, there is also an epistemology of ignorance. She argues in sum that we have to learn systems of ignorance. We have to know what we're not supposed to know, that there is a conscious kind of cultural and social act of not knowing or of forgetting. And I want to say that I think that many structural kinds of privilege, whether that's because I'm white or I'm able-bodied or I'm cisgender, that we have to learn how to forget the privileges that those identity markers bring to us. So I want you to think about this, because if the notion of unconscious bias or structural privilege is new to you, and you happen to be able to access, based on your own embodiment, a number of those different structural privileges, I'd like to think about, how is ignorance manufactured and maintained, and how might the corporate workplace participate in this epistemology of ignorance? So, what are some of the things that we can do to promote change? Because if we know that gender wage gap is a problem, we know that we have to change it. And I'm going to share one other piece of data with you. We know that if there are not very many women in a workplace, when women are underrepresented, they are more vulnerable to sexual harassment. This matters because, as of 2019, the National Institute of Justice estimates that employers pay almost $5 billion annually for traditional crimes of violence, including rape, assault, and murder. And this estimate excludes sick and disability pay. So companies are losing money, and if you only care about the bottom line, you should care about this, because it means that you're not making as much as you want. Another way to think about how we can change the culture is this. According to a recent meta-analytical study, quote, high gender diversity in the workplace has a much greater positive capability to generate high levels of knowledge combination, and thus the potential to enhance innovation performance, end quote. And what that really means is that employees work better together. They generate better ideas and more creative ideas when there's diversity, especially gender diversity. Additionally, according to recent data collected by Sheryl Sandberg and Rachel Thomas's nonprofit organization Lean In, quote, if women participated in the US workforce at the same rate as men, it would add $4.3 trillion to the American economy by 2025, and it would give millions of American families greater financial security, end quote. We know right now, when people are struggling during this pandemic, when businesses are failing, that greater financial stability is crucial. A couple other things. A large study that was completed in 2015 suggests that, quote, women directors not only contribute more distinct types of expertise, but also particular sets of expertise currently missing in incumbent corporate boards, end quote. And some of those have to do with communication style, leadership style, management style, and even investment styles. There's some data that says that investment strategies differ for men and women. That's probably culturally learned, but it matters. I want to also say that greater board and management diversity can also enhance communication channels, and it can enhance links with external shareholders. Finally, if diversity and inclusion presents challenge, and it does, because we're going to have workers who are resistant to, even hostile to, diversity in their workplaces, it also presents opportunities, but only if we change the culture and practice true and intentional and systemic inclusion, and not just diversity. Thanks so much for joining us for this SEA Academy. I really appreciate it. I also want to say I really respect the work that you all are doing. So I'm, again, Cindy Lacom, Director of Gender Studies at Slippery Rock University, signing off. Thanks very much.